Over my shoulder is the new Genesis GV60, the first of 3 fully electric Genesis models to launch here in Australia this year. It's going to start with the GV60, which is on the small side of the mid-size SUV segment here in Australia, but later there'll also be a bit of a crowd pleaser in the electrified GV70, already one of our favourite luxury SUVs here on Chasing Cars. And there's also the electrified G80, which is a full-size sedan, certainly more niche than the SUVs, but interesting nonetheless. But today we're going to start with the GV60, which is available in hot all-wheel drive trim or hotter performance all-wheel drive format, all of them with stacks of power, and they're both very quick. But this vehicle is based on the same platform as cousins like the Hyundai Ioniq 5 and Kia EV6, but the Genesis GV60 is obviously more expensive than those vehicles. So is it worth over $100,000 before on-road costs? We're going to look at that critically in today's video, but before we get started, hit subscribe and the notification bell. After you've accessed the GV60 with a kind of color matched G Matrix key, which is pretty cool, you find yourself in an interior which is fairly lush and available in a choice of different colorways. This mint colored car outside has been matched to the glacier white interior, which is a real statement, but it's certainly an interior that you would want to get treated by a professional detailer before you start driving the car, because it's already starting to mark up quite badly in this vehicle, including on the steering wheel and on the side bolsters of the seats. However, that could be treated and dealt with, but for people that don't want to mess around with upkeep of a light colored interior, there are darker color schemes available, including a very fetching navy blue with lime green stitching in the performance model exclusively, and that looks very cool. However, if you're a subscriber to Chasing Cars, and I encourage you to do so, you'd know that I'm partial to a light colored interior, so you know I'd probably just put up with having to wipe it down here and there. But what are we actually looking at in here in terms of hardware? Well, if you spend any time in a Hyundai Ioniq 5 or a Kia EV6, you're going to notice quite a lot of shared hard points. It's not necessarily a shared fit out, it's just that everything is in pretty much the same place, including this floating console here, which is very cool, and the additional storage area down here by your legs and the flat floor. And that's because the shared platform E-GMP has a lot of commonality to it. But what you're going to find in the Genesis is higher quality appointments, more lush materials, and better sound in particular, because this car has a 17 speaker Bang & Olufsen stereo, which blows away the good Bose stereo in the Ioniq 5 and the deeply average Meridian stereo in the Kia EV6. Looking forward, we also have a really nice thin bezel dual screen display. Both displays are 12.3 inches in size. This one kind of has your navigation, it's got media, it's got settings, but the GV60 is the first Hyundai Group vehicle in Australia to launch an updated version of the infotainment where you can do a lot more through the driver's display, including seeing a map in front of you first time, and an amazing augmented reality mode with a camera-driven system which shows you exactly what lane and what direction you need to go in on the road in front of you. This stuff has been quite gimmicky in the past, but Genesis gets it right, and typically the camera systems used in these vehicles are excellent, so it has the resolution to actually help you. Speaking of cameras, you've probably noticed this one sitting next to me here, and that's that this vehicle is fitted with digital side mirrors. Now, the digital mirrors in the Audi E-tron were absolutely appalling. Small, poor field of view, downright dangerous when reversing, but Genesis has done it better. Firstly, the screens are much bigger, the field of view is superior, the camera quality is higher, and even at night they're reasonable, but I still have this niggling feeling that it's an answer to a question that nobody posed, and that a traditional side mirror still gets the job done just fine. But you can of course go off in the comments if you disagree with me. Now, we're sitting on comfortable, supportive chairs, beautiful quilting, Nappa leather, lots of directions of travel, including the ability to tilt yourself way, way back, like fully back, like sleeping back if you're charging the car so you can meditate or rest, which is quite cool. But the passenger seat is still a second-class citizen in this vehicle, so it doesn't get the adjustable side bolsters and it doesn't get massage. Only the driver gets that stuff, and most German rivals equalize the front seats, so that's just something worth keeping in mind. We've got a climate panel down here, all the buttons are easy to understand, very cool shifter which flips from an ambient lit crystal sphere into a direction changer down here, heated and cooled seats as well, which is all really cool. In terms of what's missing, there's really only two things. Firstly, the sunroof doesn't open on any variant, so it's just glass precisely where you wouldn't want it, high up in the vehicle. And there's no wireless Apple CarPlay and Android Auto, because the Hyundai Group's feud with the smartphone manufacturer still hasn't been resolved, to the detriment of customers. One of the problems of dedicated battery electric cars right now is that most of them are based around skateboard batteries, which is just a big flat rectangular battery which sits underneath the floor of the vehicle. In the GV60, it's a big 77.4 kilowatt hour unit, and I'm sitting on it. And my legs know about that, because while up front there's a nice little cutout in front of the battery to keep you feeling comfortable, here in the back your legs have got nowhere to go, and as such your knees are kind of around your cheeks, figuratively speaking. It's just that you're kind of left with this situation, whereas in a Genesis GV70 combustion SUV or something, your legs are a little bit more supported by the base of the seat. Now, it's a bit of a shame because the rest of the back seat of this car is actually really good. It's not very large, it's actually quite compact for a midsize SUV, and yet legroom is fine. I'm 6 foot, headroom is good. There's a nice cutout here for the glass roof, which is also very tinted, so it shouldn't be a problem here in summer, particularly with a white interior like this car. Tow room though is very poor. This seat is on the deck and I just can't get my feet underneath it at all. However, we've got some amenities. Flip down armrest here with 2 cup holders, massive amount of storage down here in this center console, 2 USB-C ports, heated rear seats, soft materials everywhere, beautiful suede headliner in this car, and lovely touches like a beautiful little metal latch here where you can put your jacket. It's beautifully finished, this car, a proper Genesis rather than a tarted up Hyundai. And there's a real practical touch here in the back seat because the GV60 has a vehicle to load function, a proper household power point here in the back, and also the ability to use the external charge point for the same job. So not only can you charge up your laptop here, you can also plug in stuff like a fridge if you go camping. Very convenient. We have the Genesis word mark here in the center, and a really nice design touch is that up here in the sort of duckbill spoiler is where the brake light, the third brake light, is integrated, and it looks really cool when you're driving behind the car. Genesis is already known for being very design forward, and the GV60 is easily the most progressive of its shapes yet. It won't be for everyone. Genesis itself says that this car is really designed to appeal to those who don't mind being a bit ostentatious, and if that's you, there's an absolutely amazing color called Sao Paulo yellow, which is like tennis ball yellow. It looks awesome. This color is Hanema mint, also really nice, but you can go for more classic combinations. There's a navy blue. There's also a selection of matte colors if that's your thing as well. Genesis word mark here on the back. We've got the sort of twin tail lights echoed at the front of the car as well, and the boot release is actually down here, which is fine, but on a wet and muddy day like today, your hand does get a bit dirty, which is not luxurious. Power tailgate gets out of the way quickly, and the boot it's okay. It's on the small side, 432 litres. It's still acceptable for the mid-size segment, but there are a couple of clever features in here, including a really nice boot floor that folds up to the side to reveal the charging cables, or up like that, so you don't actually have to take all of your crap out of the boot in order to get the charger out of the car. Really nice thinking. We've also got a blind here, and underneath the boot floor you won't find a spare wheel. Instead, you're going to get a tire mobility kit. So for those who do a lot of country touring or gravel road driving, that's something to keep in mind, but increasingly common in this space. Now we've got controls up here to close the tailgate or to close it and lock the vehicle. And last thing before we take a drive is to discuss running costs. Overseas, you can get a rear-wheel drive version of the GV60 that does have something of a frunk or a fruit, depending on where you're watching from. But in Australia, both versions are all-wheel drive, meaning they have a motor here on the front axle. And here's where we run into one of the packaging flaws with E-GMP, the chassis that sits underneath this car. Space just hasn't really been left over for proper storage here at the front. As you can see, you could get maybe a fairly small traveling charging cable for the car into this area, but that is about it. Whereas something like a Tesla Model Y Performance, which is also dual motor, has a proper storage space up front for a carry-on suitcase. The GV60 is a cheap vehicle to run because Genesis throws in an awful lot for free with this car. Firstly, when you buy it, you can nominate to either get a wall box installed at your house, single phase AC, or you can get 5 years of free charging through the ChargeFox network here in Australia, including ultra rapid chargers. So those two offers will suit different buyers. It's nice to have the choice. You also get 5 years of free servicing with the car. However, servicing is required every 12 months for this vehicle, which is a little bit too often for an electric vehicle, particularly on a dedicated platform in our view. There's also a 5-year unlimited kilometer warranty, and there's 5 years of what's called Genesis Concierge, so they can do things like restaurant bookings, and they also come and collect the car for you when it needs maintenance and, leave you with a loan car and stuff like that to try and make life easy. So really the only thing that you'll be spending money on is charging the vehicle, and that comes down to a question of efficiency. Now, on my drive today here in the Victorian countryside, a little bit of town work, a little bit of high-speed country roads, I was able to get 17 kilowatt hours per 100 kilometers, which is very good. However, on a few sections of road where the pace was higher and we were climbing mountains, that escalated to about 22. But either way, the efficiency seems decent for the Genesis GV60, and that implies a range of somewhere above 400 kilometers in the real world, which is pretty usable. Now, what's it actually going to cost you to charge this thing up? Well, it has a 77.4 kilowatt hour battery, and that means from home, if you were charging it from empty to full, that'd cost you around $20. But if you bias your public charging at ChargeFox and you nominate that offer when you buy the car, you could really run this thing almost for free, which is a pretty good offer. So then, what is the GV60 like to drive? Well, it won't surprise you that there are certainly some shared experiences between this car and the other vehicles that sit on the E-GMP platform, but Genesis has worked its magic over the GV60 to make it more refined and more comfortable than a vehicle like the Hyundai Ioniq 5. And from behind the wheel, the suspension tuning and the steering tune in particular are quite different to both the Ioniq 5 and the Kia EV6. Now, the GV60 kind of enters an interesting point in the electric car landscape because it costs about $100,000 before on-road costs, or 107 grand if you go for the performance trim. And there just aren't that many EVs kind of sitting in that space at the moment. If you think about something like an Audi E-tron, that's a vehicle that starts at like $130,000. This car is a little bit cheaper than a BMW iX3, which is probably its main rival at the moment, but there's still a lot of movement into this space from traditional companies. Of course, perhaps the biggest non-traditional rival to the GV60 is the Tesla Model Y, which is currently only being delivered in Australia in entry-level rear-wheel drive format, though there will be a dual-motor performance, which is a direct competitor to the GV60 arriving later on. But after a full day of driving this car already, I can certainly tell you that the GV60 is a more luxurious vehicle than the Tesla Model Y. The ride is vastly more comfortable and the interior appointments are superior. So when you think about the fact that this car costs about $10,000 more than a Model Y performance, I think you're getting value for money there, particularly when you take into account the 800-volt nature of this car's platform and its ultra rapid charging. I actually think in terms of value for money, they've got it into an interesting spot. So let's talk mechanicals. The first choice you'll have to make is whether you go for the GV60 all-wheel drive or the GV60 performance all-wheel drive. The difference is $7,000 in spend, but there's a significant performance difference too. So in the standard all-wheel drive model, you get 234 kilowatts of power and 605 Newton meters of torque, which is still plenty and good enough for a 5.5 second 0 to 100 time Genesis claims. But if you spend 7 grand more for the performance all-wheel drive, you get the same 77 kilowatt hour battery and the same motor hardware on the front and rear axle, but performance is turned up to 320 kilowatts of power. Plus you've got this lime green boost button on the steering wheel, which will give you 10 seconds of maximum performance at a time with 360 kilowatts of power and 700 Newton meters of torque available. And that cuts the sprint to 4 seconds for 0 to 100, at least Genesis claims that to be the case. Now, interestingly, you can use the boost button again and again and again, as long as the battery state of charge is above 20%. And that does beg the question of why it isn't just 360 kilowatts of power at full throttle. I think it pretty much just comes down to novelty value of having a button down here that says boost. And hey, it's a party trick, which is kind of cool. But even without using boost mode, this vehicle offers gobs of performance off the line and really nice rolling acceleration. You're never going to be wanting for power in either the base GV60 or the performance variant. They're both up to the challenge of overtaking hard launches. There's an elegant sufficiency of power in these vehicles. And the motors are also really nice and refined. All E-GMP cars are good in this regard, but the motors are absent of whine, they're really nicely muffled, and they just give you this silky, serene sort of performance underfoot. Now, serene is also what you'd call the interior of the GV60 across most surfaces, because there is active noise cancellation in the headliner, which is cool, and that keeps the car nice and quiet. And by and large, the ride is also pretty good. The base cars ride on 20-inch wheels, the performance gets 21s, and so we're dealing with a big wheel and tyre package here, a relatively low profile tyre with Michelin Pilot Sport EV tyres as well. So the unsprung mass is quite high, so if you drop a wheel into a pothole or something, you are going to know about it, but the damping is good on this car. It uses a camera-driven adaptive suspension to look for bumps and potholes and prepare the dampers for the impact, and that works well. In my experience with my long-term Genesis GV80, I found that in inclement weather or at night, the camera didn't always see bumps and you'd get a bit of a clatter up through the cabin. I do like the damping. It deals with big bumps nicely, but there is a bit of a pitter-patter through the suspension that hasn't been completely dialed out, so it never fully settles down. There's always a little bit of fidget through the car. Just going that step further would have been good, but the GV60 doesn't have an Australian suspension tune. Instead, the Aussie engineers at Hyundai in Australia select from a menu of global configurations of suspension and decide what works well on Australian roads, and for the most part it does. There's just that last little bit of fidget which doesn't quite feel $100,000, which would be nice to have settled down in the vehicle, but by and large it's very livable. The steering is noticeably heavier in tune to something like an Ioniq 5 in particular, which has super light steering, and I think most buyers will like that, associating this sort of heavy, resistant steering with luxury. I wouldn't mind for a setting in the electric power steering to be a little bit lighter, but it's okay as it is, delivered through this relatively large diameter steering wheel, which is quite lush in the white. It's got paddle shifters behind it, which controls the regenerative braking all the way up to an I-pedal mode, which I use most of the time, which is one pedal driving. It feels good underfoot, and in keen cornering, it also lets you really balance the chassis on the throttle, lifting off slightly to kind of tuck the rear end of the vehicle around, allow a little bit of kind of lift off oversteer, and then you can get back on the throttle hard to drive the car out of the corner. So even though it's quite a heavy vehicle, it is a decent dance partner on a country road. But really the GV60 is happier in this stuff. Gentle curves on country roads, grand touring kind of stuff, weekend road trips, this car loves them. In terms of safety features, it's very well equipped. I've spoken about the blind spot cameras here, which actually work well in the case of digital side mirrors. The field of view is good, although your eyes do have to change focus. That's one issue compared to a traditional mirror. You also have blind spot cameras here in the driver's digital cockpit, so there's really no excuse for not seeing something out of this car. There's AEB, reversing AEB, lane keep assist with lane centering, adaptive cruise control, a full set of safety features to make this car easier and safer to drive. So those are my first impressions of the new Genesis GV60. This is a capable vehicle. In either specification, they're really quick and both offer a good usable amount of range, backed up by an 800-volt architecture that means this vehicle can be charged extremely quickly. So it's a good grand touring and road trip partner. Yes, it is heavy and it does feel its weight when you find a really tight bit of road, but for most people that won't be an issue, because this is a great runabout in town and very nice to take out to the countryside to a winery, just like this, which it has the range to get to. Now, those are my opinions. Let me know down below whether you think the GV60 is worth what Genesis wants you to pay. Any other thoughts you have on this new luxury midsize SUV that happens to be battery electric. While you're down there, hit subscribe, hit the notification bell, and as always, thank you for watching Chasing Cars.